Good morning and welcome to our monthly webinar series here at Weatherworks. My name is Michael Prianti, Director of Social Marketing and a lead meteorologist. Today we'll be discussing the upcoming 2022-2023 winter season with a deep dive into what we might expect here across the country, with more so a focus here in the northeastern parts of the United States. And without further ado, let's jump right into it.
Well, thanks, Mike. And I'm Mike Mihalik, Senior Meteorologist here at Weatherworks. Alongside with me is Ken Elliott. He's also a Senior Meteorologist. And we're going to go over our final winter outlook for the 2022-2023 season. And again, in this outlook, we're looking at a few different things. We're looking at our seasonal forecast overview, as we always want to show. We're going to take a look at similar or analog winter data, and that's really gives us an idea of what we are expecting this winter just from a past perspective, and then also our monthly outlooks and snow projections. So once again, I'm Mike Mihalik, and that is Ken Elliott, and I think, Ken, you're going to take it away here on the first slide.
Yeah, sure, let's go. So before we get to the forecast itself, let's talk a little bit about how forecasts are made. And we'll save you from some of the gory details because some of it can be frankly kind of ugly. But the general idea is we take a look at the gradual evolution of patterns on the global scale. So we're not looking at it was wet in New Jersey in September, or there was a big drought in New England in the mid to late summer. We're looking at what's El Nino, what's ENSO doing, what are sea surface temperatures doing, what are global ridges and troughs doing, are there lots of thunderstorms in the tropics? So all of this kind of paints a picture. And with that picture that's painted, we look back into history and say, okay, which years kind of looked similar to this? And we use pattern recognition to get a feel for how we feel the winter will evolve. Now, this is the hard part for a meteorologist is because you can't jump ship on a forecast too often and look at it every day for a long range perspective. You'll just drive yourself crazy. So once or twice a month, you kind of got to look at the forecasts and the analogs and see if they're still valid. And we've already done this a little bit, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but we have actually reevaluated some of the winters from that we thought looked good back in July and August and kind of tweaked that a little bit. And finally, when appropriate, and again, when appropriate, not all the time, but we got to use a little bit of computer model guidance. And that's not in the same way we would necessarily do it for, say, a regular storm or a regular 5-day forecast. We're not just taking some model output, temperatures and precipitation. We're looking at, okay, where are the large scale ridges and troughs? What is it forecasting El Nino to do? That sort of thing. So with care, we look at models, but not religiously.
Yeah, that's correct. Ken's got it right, 100% on that. And one of those main things that we do look at for our winter outlooks are analogs. And we say analogs a lot, and you'll hear that a lot in this webinar. So what is an analog exactly? Well, it's something that is similar or comparable to something else, either in general or some specific detail, like Merriam-Webster says right there. For our purposes, we're talking about prior winters or past winters. So past years that looked maybe a little bit similar to how we're seeing this set up for the winter coming ahead in 22 and 23. So there's nothing perfect about analogs. There's not a perfect analog out there that we can say, yes, back in 73, 74, this is exactly how this winter is going to pan out for the upcoming season. That really doesn't exist. So what we do, we try to find the closest, maybe 6 to 10 or so analogs that match up to what we're seeing this winter. And from that data, we kind of gather everything and we average all that, and that's what gives us our seasonal outlook. So if we move along, I think, Ken, we have a general pattern of what is coming from our analogs.
Yeah, this is kind of like you average the analogs that we have together, and if there was like a seasonal map, this is it. Again, this is just like if you took every day of the winter season and averaged a weather map, this is kind of what the output would look like if we did this in March, for example, after looking at the winter season. I would say the most important things for us to focus on, and which will be the real keys to the forecast, are that high pressure off the west coast of the United States and that low pressure area over central Canada. Where exactly those end up will really dictate how cold, how snowy it'll be this winter. And that can be said for almost any part of the country, honestly, because that'll dictate where the warm air is most aimed. That'll also show where the cold will most be. So those exact placements, which it will vary from time to time. I mean, if you look at a random date, January 12th, I can pretty much bet you the pattern will not look like that. But on average, it probably will, and this will dictate where the rubber meets the road, how cold it'll be on average, and where the most prolific winter weather will be.
Yeah, and I think Ken's entirely right on that. Like, this is a snapshot of the season as a whole. It's not, going to be this pattern the entire winter. If it was going to be this pattern the entire winter, that one looks pretty cold to me, but it won't. There's a lot of variability, and here's what we're looking at for our seasonal outlook. So Ken, take us through what we see here.
Sure, and we'll leave this up for a few seconds just so you guys can kind of get a feel for it. And the next two slides, by the way, will also have these maps at smaller sizes on the left-hand side. So if you didn't get a good look at the first time we have it up there, certainly it's not going to disappear on you. And you're always welcome to watch this webinar again after the fact. But I think the key here, and it sticks out right away, Upper Plains, Upper Midwest, Great Lakes into northern New England. That's where the cold is, be most focused. That's where we'll see the most frequent snowfall. And that's pretty much, on the entire seasonal scale. So basically late November up until at least late February, if not into March. Gets a little bit more variable the further south you go, not all that surprisingly. And I think some of the most interesting weather this year will likely be from where we kind of have that mixed zone kind of written on the snowfall map. And you can extend that almost all the way into the plains, through the Ohio Valley and Tennessee Valley, into the mid-Atlantic, and even up to like the New York City area. That's where we're going to have probably the most challenges this year. Not so much from necessarily a forecast perspective either, but that's where the work will be the hardest too. More mixed events, probably smaller ones, so maybe not your big storms, but the ones that become harder to plan for and actually do work on. So that's the area we're focusing on, and more on this later, but probably more early than late in the season.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a look at some of winter's key points. Obviously, number one, coldest upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Favoring the coldest part of the year in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast to actually be early, which is actually the opposite of what's happened in the last couple of years, where we've kind of had a gradual descent into winter and it was mostly back-end loaded. So that a little bit of a different feel this year, certainly. And that cold air certainly going to lead to snowfall above normal, a pretty high likelihood, especially around the Great Lakes, where we think the lake effect snow will start up rather early. Battle zone kind of already got into this idea. A lot of mixed events, and the mixed events I think favor more so like the mid to late part of the winter. So January, February. If you're looking for the more pure snow, think more December, very early January, as I think the mild air will be more inclined to kind of move up the coast and into the Ohio Valley the later we go into the winter season. Out west, a lot of snow in the upper Rockies. I feel like that high pressure off the west coast, though, probably going to make it not as snowy the further you get towards the west coast. But certainly, if you do work out in the west, or if you're going on a ski trip, Rockies probably better than, like, say, the Sierras or the Cascades this year. Kind of already alluded to this already. Pretty busy lake effect season. We've already seen a few lake effect snow showers about a week or so ago. That was probably a little bit of a harbinger of what's to come. I think that will probably peak the early to mid part of December, when those lakes are still kind of warm, and we've got some anomalously cold air moving over those lakes. So especially on the downwind eastern side, that's the place to look. And for the mid-south, even though we had some frosts down there last week, which is pretty incredible for this time of year, also the Gulf Coast, that was more of just a fluke thing. Overall mild, and probably, if not anything else, kind of dry down there.
All right, well, Ken, you gave us a real good overview of what we're expecting across the country for this winter season, but I'd like to really dive into those analogs some more, those similar years that we've seen in the past, that we really get an idea for how we try to formulate this forecast. So, the data is at the heart of what we do. It really drives how we make these forecasts for the seasonal outlooks. But it's important that this data isn't a one decisive solution. It's more of a conglomeration or an aggregate of what we have from those past seasons, and we take in account of some analogs we favored a little bit more. Maybe we like those better based on the atmospheric conditions and the waters throughout the oceans versus others. So we take into that account, but just make sure that this is, again, it's not explicitly a forecast in any way. It's not saying, oh, because we showed you that there were this many events or this many 2-inch plus snow events that is going to happen. That's not exactly how this works. It just gives us a kind of idea of what may happen based on the analog years that we looked at. So we're going to start out with snowfall because, hey, let's face it, that's what everybody's looking for, right? We want to talk about the snowfall. Everybody wants to know how much snowfall we could see. So we'll start here in the Northeast. And again, these are looking at the average of all the similar seasons, over the last, over the analogs that we've had. We compared that to the 30-year normal to see kind of what kind of variation we're seeing in these analog years. So if you're looking at this straight away, basically a lot of these towns like Allentown, Hartford, Philadelphia, a lot of these analog averages are right around normal, what you would like to see. But I think the key with this is look at that variation in a lot of these places. You look at a place like Albany, look at a place like Boston, for instance. We're talking about some of those analog years had a big variation in snowfall amounts. We're talking about 45 inches. You're talking about 60 some odd inches in one of those analog years and below 20 inches in one of those analog years. So that's really an interesting thing to point out, that there is a lot of variation that we're seeing with the years we selected. And that could be due to several things. It might just be, hey, maybe one of those years had a big major nor'easter come up the eastern seaboard, and that's why you had those really high amounts. So just take into that account, like, we have that analog average, but we also have a lot of variation that we're seeing. Now, if we look ahead over to the Midwest, looking out west, what we're seeing is that, a lot of these are a little bit more above normal, especially once you get towards the Great Lakes. You get to Detroit, you get to Chicago, a little bit above normal on those analog averages, which is quite interesting. And also in Chicago, you can see that there's not as much variance with those maximum and minimums that you see out of those analog years. So that gives us a little bit more confidence that, hey, that above normal snowfall might be something that we have to give more attention to. And then as you get down towards Cincinnati, Indianapolis, basically along that I-70 corridor and places south of there, we're seeing those analogs a little bit less than normal. So maybe that's where we start seeing that maybe there's a little bit more mixing happening down there. It should be a relatively active pattern based on La Nina. So that's something we are looking at too. So moving on to more snowfall statistics, we decided that, okay, we looked at seasonal. So let's take a quick look at measurable snowfall for these analog years. And by looking at this measurable snowfall, we're looking at greater than or equal to 0.1 inches. So basically it would be something that you'd have to go out. Maybe you have to do some salting for, maybe it's a plowable event, but at least it's something that's workable. So this gives us that idea of how many workable events are we looking at from these past years that are similar to what we expect this year. So what you can see, oh, I passed it, go back quick. So there's near to slightly above normal measurable snow days in the Midwest and New England. So that's important to point out. That kind of jives with our seasonal forecast too. There's slightly below normal measurable snow days along I-95 and into the Mid-Atlantic in the Northeast. So that kind of goes with what Ken was showing you earlier about those seasonal, overall seasonal snowfall totals that we are expecting. So now I want to look more at those bigger events. So we're looking at a more significant event, something you're going to be plowing. So we considered that to be 2 inches or more. And what we're seeing here is that, okay, we got near to slightly below normal 2-inch events in the mid-Atlantic and closer to the coast. Those above normal amount of 2-inch events further inland, up towards Albany, you can see that there's looks like up to 9 on an analog average, which is above that 10-year average. So it might be more displaced off to the north and west. Same thing out in the Midwest. We're seeing that. Look at Detroit. Detroit has an analog average that's higher than the 10-year. So we're also seeing that, hey, it looks like the further north you go, the better chance you have is seeing some of these bigger events. Chicago is quite interesting. They're a little bit below, but we still feel that with the cold air out there, there's still a lot of events that we're going to have to be dealing with, and even in the plowable side. So shifting gears from the snowfall over to temperature trends. Now keep in mind, we're still looking at similar years. So this is not exactly how it would pan out, but we took this into account when we were making our forecast. So we took those similar years, we compared them to the 30-year averages, and this is what we got for the temperatures for each month from the analog data. So the Northeast temperatures were near normal. They were mostly early in the season. Near to below normal early in the season. If you look there at New York City, you can see November, 67% of those years were below normal. January was a lot colder too. So you can see it's kind of sided towards the early half of the winter. And then we see it starting to get a little bit warmer as we head later in the winter into February, into March. So we're looking at a different setup than we have the previous years, that's for sure. And heading out to the Midwest, we have a little different of the story. While you do see that there is that cold bias early in Ohio over towards Columbus, that kind of disappears the cold bias early is what I mean in Ohio, and then the warmer late, that disappears when you go further west out towards Indianapolis and Chicago. That near to below normal cold is kind of hanging out there most of the winter. So that really gives us a better idea of, oh, hey, now look, we were thinking it could be cold out here. Now the analogs are showing us that it could be near to below normal cold around the Great Lakes and out towards Chicago. It's a little bit more favored. So that's, again, giving us a little bit support to what we were thinking in that seasonal outlook. And the last thing we want to look at was, so how many really cold days are there going to be? So we thought that, well, if daytime highs are 32 degrees or less, that's probably going to be a really cold day. So we looked at that through the analog years, or those similar years for the upcoming season. We compared that to the 30-year average to see, are we seeing more or less? Well, what's interesting is that there's about a near normal amount of very cold days to the south, but many locations to the north and west show a little bit more than average very cold days, which is quite interesting. And what that may mean is that there might be more cold shots early on, especially early when we're expecting that pattern to be a lot more amplified and maybe a little bit more stormy in the Northeast. It could mean a couple different things. It could mean we're looking at possibly a lot more freeze situations too. If we're getting 32-degree highs, but we're still going to have some mild situations happening at times from what our forecast was saying. So it's quite interesting that we did see that among the analog years throughout the entire area. And this is just pointing out really quickly that, hey, take a look at these areas that are further south, that they're seeing those near average 32-degree days, but further north, you're seeing those above average. So a lot
And I would
more.
say,
Go ahead, Ken.
Mike, anecdotally, I mean, the past couple of years when it's been cold, it's been cold.
Yeah.
Even though the seasons might have averaged out kind of warm, it's been, we've had these like, 1 to 3 day spurts on a couple of them where it's been
Yeah.
anomalously cold. It doesn't have any staying power necessarily, but even down to the Carolinas, even further south than these maps go, it's not just like a one-off thing. And I think that might be what we're seeing again this year in the analog data, and certainly portends to what might actually happen, like we kind of alluded to, December and January.
Right, absolutely. Definitely a good point, Ken. What I do want to do is, that was a lot of information about the analog years really, really quick. So I want to kind of sum up what we're seeing and the takeaways that we're getting from looking at these past years. So what they're showing us is that in the Northeast, early cold is more likely, and we're looking for a transition to milder weather late January into February and March. We're seeing the number of days with 32-degree highs or less are around average or a little bit greater than normal. We're seeing that seasonal totals were near normal for most, but there was a lot of variability. In other words, we got to use those with caution for sure. We don't want to jump the gun on what we're seeing there with all that variability. And the measurable snow days and the 2-inch events were less near the coast and in the mid-Atlantic. So that's something certainly we're pointing out. So what does all that mean? If we try to mash that all together and what that's telling us, what we kind of surmise is that even though the snow day event analysis looks less than normal, there's still going to be many cold shots, especially early on. There's going to be more mixed events that has been that may be the cause for that less amount of snow that we're seeing, especially near the coast. And the greatest likelihood of above normal snowfall is well inland, talking about places up in upstate New York, central Pennsylvania, north central Pennsylvania, into the Great Lakes out towards Chicago. Out in the Midwest, here's the takeaways we're seeing from there. Again, a little bit different on the temperatures. More prolonged cold is expected, especially north and west of I-70. We're looking at the number of days below 32 or equal to 32 greater than normal. We're seeing seasonal totals above normal for the to the north and near to slightly below normal to the south. And while 2-inch events were near to slightly below normal in the Ohio Valley, the measurable days were near to slightly above normal. So that's an interesting thing there too. So what does that all mean? Extended cold shots of air are more likely out in the Midwest, just not early in the season. This can happen the entire time. The snowfall will likely be greater than normal north of I-70, especially near Chicago and the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley will likely stay active with mixed events potentially holding down those big snowfalls, and that's why we saw maybe a little bit less of those 2-inch events, but maybe that's a result of it being active, but a little bit more mixy as some of that mild air starts pushing north.
So here's where kind of like the rubber meets the road. These are our bi-monthly outlooks, roughly early season, mid-season, and late season. Now these are a lot of the analog data is back here. Again, not the only thing, but you'll see here we've got pretty much cold forecast across the board. You have to go pretty much into the mid-south or the plains to get to like close to normal temperatures. How fast this happens in November, still a little questionable, but I don't think we're going to see anything too crazy in the near term future. I think it's more like closer to Thanksgiving is when this cold air really starts to get going. And once it's here, it's going to probably be around more than it's not through December. That leads over to snowfall, which, this will be the theme, upper Midwest, Great Lakes, absolutely, favoring the above normal, with fairly good confidence. Mm-hmm. Getting down a little further south, not quite as much confidence, but just based upon just an active enough pattern in the cold temperatures, I think we'll do okay on snow for most of the I-95 corridor, even down into Virginia. And now that's going to probably be on the strength of some smaller events, not so much like your 6, 10, 12-inch plus storms. And even up in New England, there might not be as much moisture per event as that we're used to. So think more like, half to like 4-inch kind of events instead of like these, you get it all at once, which obviously has complications for, you're going to be doing, work more often, but maybe not as much on a particular day. So this becomes one of these things where, unlike where you can kind of, get 10 inches in 1 or 2 shots, this might be more like you get it in 4 times. So just be aware of that it'll be a little bit more, despite the number of events maybe not being all that different than usual, you might not be getting as much per event. And that's especially the case the further south you go. As we go into mid-season, this is where the heart of the forecast will be decided. January will be a transition month. How quickly that transition occurs will be the key. Right now, we think it basically is going to wash out to an average forecast, kind of like in that mixed zone that we talked about earlier, where the warmer air comes up from the south will likely lead to above normal temperatures, again, on the average for the 2-month period. But does this happen the first or second week of January? Probably not. Once we start getting past mid-month, though, the chance for that warm air coming up north will certainly increase. So once you start getting up to places like Williamsburg, Virginia, even Washington, D.C., it's going to definitely get a little milder as we go into January and especially February. Meanwhile, Great Lakes, Midwest, Upper Plains, cold air's entrenched. So up there, snow events continue, whereas we forecast a little bit below normal snowfall to the south, a lot based upon that mixing, and even maybe some plain rain events once you get really far south and right along the immediate coast. So the active-ish pattern really doesn't go away necessarily. I just think the warmer air is going to win out a little bit more as you go into February, especially, and we'll be, as we've kind of alluded to this entire webinar, snowfall, especially in the 95 corridor south of, like, say, New York City, will be heavily predicated on the first, half to 2/3 of the season.
I just wanted to point out, Ken, too, is that, even though we are seeing possibly a little bit slightly below average snowfall in some of these areas, remember back to the analogs that we talked about, and we talked about those 32-degree days being still quite numerous. So even if we have some rain events in here, there still could be some, some refreeze situations happening, or maybe some black ice situations happening with those 32 degrees being quite high. So that is something that we're going to have to watch very carefully. And like Ken alluded to too, obviously more mixing with the warm air coming up. So even if those snowfalls are less than what we're seeing, we still could have these mixed events, which are difficult to deal with if you're in the snow and ice removal industry.
And to your point, Mike, remember these are temperature differences from average. It's still pretty cold in January through a good portion of February. So just because you're above normal in January, it's still cold enough.
That's true.
Especially, and that just makes the refreezes even more of a situation. And again, a lot of places it's cold. At average temperature at the end of January is cold. There's no way around it. So if you're slightly above, it's still cold.
It's still, climatologically, it's still the snowiest part of the year for much of the Northeast and into the Ohio Valley. So, it's not like it won't snow. Let's get that right out for everybody to say. But heading into late season, Ken, what do we got?
Yeah, it looks like that the warm air coming in from the south and east will continue to be felt, especially mid-March and on. I think March 15th is going to probably be like a date of demarcation where it becomes just a whole lot harder once you get out of New England. It's, again, not the busiest season in terms of like biggest significant snows, but I still think that we'll still have some plowable events, at least in early March, at least threatening up in New England, maybe the Hudson Valley, places like that. And again, not a whole lot of change in the forecast out into the Midwest and plains. Less cold, yes, but still active enough where it's going to be probably a fairly, it'll feel like a long winter. I mean, because I think there's a good chance that we have some snow out that way in November, and every bit of a chance that we see an above normal snow at least through March and maybe even to the first half of April. So it'll be a long and drawn out season for a lot of these folks too. And you'll probably start to feel that once you start getting into the later part of March as the sun starts to do its work, and then maybe that snowstorm drops 2 inches, but it basically becomes a refreeze.
Yeah. So that's a good overview of what we're going to see for the northeast quarter of the country. Let's try to break that down a little bit more here, Ken, with those snowfall projections that you probably saw in our email forecast that we sent out. Now, just keep in mind, we're trying to break this into confidence intervals here, whether we're going to see that below normal, the near normal area, or the above normal for your particular city. And we kind of structured this just like our storm alert forecast. So you do see a similarity to that where, here's the range of possibilities that we're looking at for this upcoming season. And Ken, I'm sure you can point out some interesting cities here that the snowfall
Sure.
worked out.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's good to take the big picture on this. First of all, I'll point out we took care not to use the average snowfall here. While the average is a helpful statistic, it kind of can be overly unduly influenced by either really snowy or really lack of snow winters. So it kind of
Mhm.
makes things a little bit more cohesive, especially when you start to get into areas that don't get as much snow as, say, like a Boston or a Bangor, Maine does. But either way, let's take a look at Boston, for example. Median snowfall of 39 inches. And we looked at the data and basically said, okay, a third of the winters historically end up between 32 and 46 inches. And we think this year there's a 45% chance we end up in the normal realm. If you notice, though, there's a pretty good number there on that above 46 inches, which is well into the above normal category. So another way to look at this too is that we think there's a 75% chance Boston finishes the season with near to above normal snowfall. And you can kind of apply that general chain of logic to any one of these. So let's take a look at like New York City, for example. A little more concerned about a little bit more of the warmer air kind of sneaking up there mid to late season. So not surprisingly, kind of dropped off the higher end of the above normal snowfall a little bit. But again, we're not expecting like a lack of moisture either. So it's not like we're really changing the low end of the forecast. We're just feeling a little bit better about the median, the average point being closer to what we normally would expect in New York City, for example. And similar things as you go a little further south, as you would expect, we start to put a little bit more in the below normal, just because of the fact that we can't ignore the fact that there's more in the way of warmer air. One thing I will caution anyone, and this applies to any seasonal snowfall, once you start getting below, like once the median started getting below 20 inches, then we start worrying about like one or two singular events can quickly add up. So
Mhm.
if you look at our maps, you might say, well, I'm kind of surprised you did X or Y or Z. Well, in the case of Washington D.C., for example, anything above 7 inches gets you into the normal category. 7 to 13 inches, which is a relatively small range anyway. So one or two events can quickly change that one way or the other. So we were a little bit more guarded than that, just based upon the fact that we didn't want to like completely say, okay, because even though we think that it's going to be whatever, that we didn't want to end up in one bin too high versus the other, just to allow for variability. And again, those patterns that we showed in the earlier slides, those are averages. We expect variations. We expect there to be some kind of deviation from those at times. And if that time happens to be, and all of a sudden there is that one good coastal storm, Washington, D.C., even if it doesn't snow more than 2 or 3 times all year, can easily
Mhm.
get into the normal or even above normal if things pan out that way.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the past too, Ken, where one storm has made a huge difference on the winter, where you get one big 2-foot storm, and well, that changes things a whole lot as far as snowfall is concerned. You might only have 5 or 6 inches, through the whole winter until you get that big one.
Sure does.
So
And that's especially
that's.
the case on the East Coast, where you get more potential for more moisture-laden
Mhm.
systems. And as you see on this page with the Midwest and Great Lakes area, the ranges are a little bit more normalized. There's less variation just inherently. So we feel good about things, and especially in this case, for example, since we feel that it's going to be pretty cold and active all year, we're pretty confidently kind of leaning away in most of these areas from below normal seasons. It's just going to be hard, and with the idea that even no matter what else happens, that it's hard to have a big range in snowfall anyway, like we saw in the analogs. Well, we feel even better about that. So a lot of these cities, we have pretty high numbers on near to above normal across the board. It's not really until you get down to like towards like south of I-7 that we talked about earlier, like Cincinnati. Even there, we're going with a generally normal idea for the winter. But otherwise, it's decidedly near to above normal.
Yeah. And Ken, I think that pretty much wraps up our snowfall projections, that's for sure. And pretty much wraps up our winter outlook right now. Ken, I really appreciate you being here, on the webinar and going over a lot of those maps for overall perception of what our winter is expected to be like. But keep in mind that, hey, we do have a winter outlook update that comes out in January. So we'll kind of give you an idea of how things have went so far, why they went that way, and what we're expecting as we head into February and March and late winter. That's one of the things we'll have for you. We also have winter risk, so please keep that in mind. If you want more frequent updates for the long range forecast, Ken has a big hand in winter risk along with our long range meteorologists, and there's lots there that you can learn about storm threats 6 to 14 days out, and even into the 15 to 30 day period, where we'll tell you about plowable, saltable snow events, things of that nature. Something that's more actionable for you guys in the snow and ice industry. If you want any more information on that, certainly sales@weatherworksinc.com. And last, our next webinar, which will be coming up in November, will be about our new pavement prediction product that you'll see in our storm alert forecast. We'll talk all about that, what it can tell you in that webinar coming up in November. So that pretty much does it here for our Winter Outlook webinar for 2022 and 2023. Remember to visit us at weatherworksinc.com. And as always, on our social media channels, just search for Weatherworks. You'll find us on just about any one of those channels out there. So thanks again for being there with us. I'm Mike Mihalik, and that is Ken Elliott, and we were happy to share this forecast with you, and we hope it helps you along the way through the winter season.